Welcome to the Computational Medicine Podcast, where we discuss AI and computational tools being deployed in medicine. I'm Alex, a doctor working in London. Today we're talking to Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University. His work is wide-ranging, including research on societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement and new technology, as well as assessing the capabilities and understanding of future technologies. His research includes work on cognitive enhancement, technical roadmaps to whole brain emulation, neuroethics, and global catastrophic risks. We had a fantastic conversation about his work. I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much, Dr. Sandberg, for agreeing to chat to us today. I mean, so I've been following a lot of your papers a lot for the last few years, and it's so exciting to be able to chat to you today as one of the founding members of the Future of Humanity Institute. You can make a very, very compelling case that you and Bostrom and I guess when it comes to that sort of institution that tries to mitigate long-term risk, it would be Future of Humanity and Future of Life Institute with Max Tegmark. Those would be usually the two first ones that come to your mind. So really, really exciting to be able to talk to you guys today.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So I'll do a more in-depth introduction to you and your work in the sort of post-production editing stuff. But if you could just give us an overview of your work and your research related to the Future of Humanity Institute and any specific project you're working on.
So I arrived at the Future Humanity Institute in a project thinking about the social and ethical impact of human enhancement technology. But then I just got dragged into thinking about the future long-term in all sorts of ways. So I've been doing a fair bit of work on existential risks and various global catastrophic risks, trying to understand both the specifics of a risk and the bigger question, how do we govern these complicated things? On the other hand, my really big project right now is on the positive side. After all, why save the future if it's just meh? So the question is, how big, long, and grand can the future be? So I'm having this multi-year project on essentially trying to review what we can say about the long-term future and the upper limits of what can be achieved by an intelligent species, which of course has interesting implications for question about how much should we struggle for the value of the future. What are the options that we might have to decide on early on? But most of all, I'm interested in all sorts of cross-cutting questions. Everything from funny papers like what if Earth turns into blueberries for kind of physics education, over to questions about how cultural transmission works, over to interdisciplinary work really on trying to figure out better ways of thinking rigorously about the long-term future.
And I remember you mentioning in a previous podcast that you, unlike a lot of your colleagues, you don't think off the top of your head sort of what are the key things. You sort of can't find something that's really interesting, and then you sort of run with that a little bit. Is that correct?
I wish I was great at focusing on the most important problem ever, but I can't. I got kind of academic ADHD. I run after the latest shiny problem. But instead, I'm using my rather high energy level to jump between multiple projects. So occasionally important stuff gets done. And when I'm putting off finishing an important project, I'm working on something else. And as long as I make sure that the project I'm working on are mostly fairly useful, the end result is actually a large number of somewhat useful papers that show up. I know other people who spend a lot of time agonizing about they must only do one thing. And yeah, that doesn't work for me. And I think figuring out academically the right kind of workflow is important. And some people have very different workflow. So there is no right or wrong here, just a question, are you effective or not?
Absolutely. And so looking at our values today, so I think this ties into the book that you are writing a little bit. So potentially you might have been. I can imagine you've been thinking a fair amount about this. So our values today compared to say 200 or 1,000 years ago are very, very different. So you take someone from then, you put them into today, they'd be very surprised by a lot of the values that we have now. And a lot of the values that we look at previously we see as odd today. What values do you think that we have today in 1,000 years or so? Do we think that future generations are going to look back on as odd that we do now?
Well, There are the obvious things that we already have a suspicion that might be ongoing moral catastrophes. For example, factory farming is probably within a few decades going to be looked back at saying that, look, that's almost as bad as that racism that was endemic 100 or 200 years ago, and we should be almost as taboo. So you get that kind of obvious cases. You also get more subtle things. What virtues do we care about? So, what one set of virtues and values that has grown in importance the last century are environmental ones. So today, being a sustainable and environmentally conscious person is something that you get approved for in society, and many of us feel a twinge of guilt when we do something we know that that was not quite sustainable. It's a weird set of values because they're actually much more collective and individual. It's not that relevant how much I fly, but rather how many people fly in general. I can't really cause the extinction of a species, but together a society can do. So many of these virtues are more structural in our civilization and our societies. And these are very weird virtues. Aristotle and his friends would not have recognized them because the environment was not an issue in ancient Greece. What I think is going to happen with our values over the coming 1,000 years is there's going to be dramatic changes in what we can do, and that is going to change some of the fundamentals. For example, sex and reproduction used to be impossible to separate. Then we got contraceptives, and suddenly sexual values could shift in various ways. We might similarly have aspects of reproduction where we use technology, and we might very well develop a lot of values that we currently would say are unthinkable simply because, yes, in the future it would be child endangerment of not fixing their genes before they're born. Even more radical might be that if we get various advanced technologies like brain emulation, which we're probably going to talk much more about in the later part of the program, um, we are going to maybe separate aspects of dying. We already have separated, hopefully, pain from dying. We can do painkillers today. But you can't avoid that you have a permanent cessation of experience and identity and the loss of body. Now, if you can upload your mind and make backup copies, this falls apart. Suddenly, death becomes maybe a local thing. You might separate between having your body destroyed. Oh no, that was an expensive body. Where can I get a new one this time of day? Versus a permanent loss of experience and identity, because you can freeze your simulation for a while on a long trip, boring trip, and a permanent disappearance. You might exist in multiple ways. All of these things lead to that the current ideas about, well, okay, death is one of the worst things ever. We need strong laws against murder. We need to regulate this very tightly. Changes. You might still want to regulate it tightly, but it's going to be different laws. We're going to have vandalism rules about destroying bodies. That's very rude and gets very close to your personal sphere, but it's not as bad as deleting somebody's process from the server. So in this imaginary future, we see that values become very different. And indeed, I might decide to send out several copies of me to do something, and several of them will be deleted or destroyed. And I might be totally fine with that. At least intellectually, as an exercise, this sounds totally reasonable. I have my doubts. I would feel like that if I encountered that situation in reality. But it might show this radical change you can get from fundamental shifts in technology. But it's important to remember that we also, of course, might have moral progress. We might discover important philosophical arguments or have cultural changes going forward. Of course, some critics might say, yeah, maybe it's not all moral progress, it might even be moral regression. And I think another important thing is that we need to actually work rather hard for our rather expensively won successes in the moral domain and protect from sexism and racism and various forms of homophobia, etc. There are many values that we actually need to shore up, and we should never forget that we constantly need to be vigilant and protect them.
Absolutely. Just exciting times. Dipping back into your book, what was your rough estimation of how long you think it'll be before it comes out? As always with these things, deadlines come up and then they come and go, and one idea comes up and gets typed out. But any rough estimates?
Well, I think the best estimate is probably using the Lindy effect. This is the idea that if something has been around for a number of time units, you should expect to be around for about the same number of time units in the future. So, approaching that to the book, it would say, okay, I should expect to be finished with it in about 5 years. Uh, and the funny thing is, of course, if somebody listens to this podcast in 5 years' time, they might just say, okay, it's still not out. We know it's 10 years, so we should expect it in 10 years' time.
Always the way. Parkinson, very much tied in with Parkinson's law. Yeah.
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 So those Parkinson's law and similar stylized ideas about how our world works, some of them are much less reliable than others, but there are surprising discoveries. So when Parkinson formulated his law that work always expands to fill the available time, he was mostly joking. It was a joke book,
Mm.
except that when we look at our lives, this is actually true. We live in a world of labor saving devices, and yet we're probably feeling more busy than ever. Not just with work, we're also getting entertainment and leisure and all those other weird activities that are neither, like answering people who are wrong on the internet, etc., etc. So we find that time is a container we always fill. And there is an interesting question why that happens. Similarly, another of Parkinson's laws that people get promoted up until the level of incompetence. There have been studies demonstrating that this is actually roughly true. So one interesting thing I'm curious about is how many of these adages are actually true and can we test it? Because finding big generalizable stylized facts about the universe, that really how we make progress. In mathematics, there are many forms of universality that are amazingly powerful. The statistical mechanics realization that certain systems average together so we can talk about the macro properties is the foundation for much of our modern engineering and physics. So we should probably be looking at more of these little joke laws and see when they apply. Turns out that Lindy's law, for example, has a lot of interesting mathematics behind it. Originally discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot, and now Toby Ord, one of my colleagues, is writing a very interesting paper about when it actually happens in the real world.
Any other of those little odd laws that come to mind when you're thinking about ones that sound a bit obscene, but then are actually completely make sense?
Hofstadter's law of planning, I think, is very useful. It always takes longer than you think, even when you
Mm.
take Hofstadter's law into account. It's, of course, also very fun because it's recursive, but it has this important realization that, yes, we have a planning fallacy. We tend to think that we know how long it's going to take, and we know for various reasons why this is not working. Yet, the fact that we know about the planning fallacy doesn't help us. Even Hofstadter's law warning us that we are not responding to that is still not enough. Which, of course, means that if you actually desperately want to have something happen on time, you need to set up mechanisms that ensure that in various ways. It's not just going to be enough to try to do normal planning. And indeed, when we look beyond our own personal projects to mega projects and giga projects and terra projects, they're quite often having magnificent cost overruns. We are very bad at managing very large projects. And that is, of course, a big problem for our society and civilization. If we were better at managing very large projects, we would be saving enormous amount of money and resources and mind power that could be used for better things. So maybe this is something we should be working much harder on.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the other ones that come to mind are, I think the Scottish Parliament was expected to be 50 million, ended up being about at least maybe 200, 300 million. Another great example. Okay, great. So moving on to whole brain emulation. Can you tell us what the current state and understanding of where are we at with whole brain emulation right now?
So whole brain emulation is the idea that we should be able to take a biological brain, scan it somehow, we leave that technology undefined for the moment, and generate a replica in a computer that has this one-to-one correspondence on the right level of description to the first brain. So when you run the replica in the computer, you get the same behavior and maybe even the same mind. This is, of course, where you get a big footnote about quarreling philosophers, because there are deep philosophical questions about what can minds exist in software, and how do you identify if a mind is the same as in the original brain, etc. not to mention questions about personal identity. But getting over to the practical question, brain emulation as a science fiction concept and a philosophical thought experiment has been around for a very long time, of course. But it was only in the 90s and early noughties we started taking it seriously as what does it actually take for a whole project like this to happen? So we did this roadmap back in 2008, which is by now very, very obsolete, I'm happy to say, where we got various people together and we sketched out what we believed was necessary, research directions that looked important, how much resource might be needed. And then we went on with our careers, and we recently, a few months ago, had another get together, and we're starting on the sequel of the roadmap. Where I'm very happy to say that it's now going. And the good news is that the computers still seem to be going in the right direction. You might have heard that Moore's law is dead or dying, and people have been saying that ever since Moore wrote his paper about Moore's law. Basically, the amount of computations per second per dollar you can get is still going up exponentially. With the important caveat that this is not because we are getting faster and faster microprocessor, but because we're using more and more parallel computation using GPUs and TPUs and other things. This is totally fine for simulating the brain because it's massively parallel. It would be very bad if it was some kind of logic system where you very rapidly have to do logical deductions between various clauses of formulas. So Moore's law is doing fine. So we should probably expect to have more than enough computing power in the future for brains. The scanning technology is an interesting question because back in 2008, we were thinking that electron microscopy, that seems to be the necessary method because that's the only thing that has the right resolution to see the cell membranes and figure out what neurons are connected to what other neurons. Optical microscopy can't cut it because it's too big. You can't see the fine details, and they're almost definitely needed. Uh, Still, there was some interesting work being done. One of the participants, Todd Huffman, ended up running the company FreeScan that actually used diamond microtomes to slice tissues and make optical reconstructions. So interesting work was being done, but we're kind of not expecting that the optical resolution would work. And there was still this problem that we probably need to figure out the chemical state of synapses and many other things. So what has happened in the intervening time is, besides that we have really advanced in the ability to scan large volumes using electron microscope. Of course, large volumes are very relative here because we're still talking about rather tiny volumes of actual brain tissue. And we found ways of reconstructing it in terms of cell membranes. And this is where deep neural networks have actually been very, very helpful. So connectomics is advancing tremendously. And today we even have a full connectome, more or less, of a fruit fly brain. That's great. But it's still only that cell membrane and the neural morphology map. But what also happened was people invented weird things like expansion microscopy. That is, you take the brain tissue, you embed it in a gel, you wash away cell membranes and other things, leaving only certain markers. And then you expand the gel. So now you have a larger sample. And now you can use an optical microscope to scan where things is and reconstruct things on a larger scale without having to use electron microscopy, which is fairly cumbersome, expensive, and tends to fry the tissue you want to study. Yeah, you're still, of course, taking the brain and fixating it and washing away stuff, so it's still not a very alive brain tissue here. But expansion microscopy hints that there might be tricks here that would allow us to get details of the brain in a completely different modality. And of course, people have also been very busy in biotechnology coming up with all sorts of weird indicators. There are interesting ideas about using molecular ticker tapes where you modify the genes of an animal. So neurons actually have their own ID numbers and can either document their own activity in form of long protein chains that you can later extract and see what we did, but also have their identities link up so you can know that it was neuron 4711 that had this activity and that it had a synapse with neuron 5,594. These are really interesting new potential methods. And there are many other issues, like maybe we can use X-ray and microscopy and diffraction. So that is looking promising. We are not there yet, but a lot of these technologies are advancing very fast, especially because we get empowered by AI methods. The big gap right now we have is in the middle. We don't quite know how to take these scans and generate a runnable simulation that we can then run. We certainly have software that is good at running neural simulations, but we still haven't done that final connection and translating the picture into something that works. And the critic would immediately chime in here and say, yeah, that's a picture. That's not a live brain. Actually, a lot of important stuff in the brain are probably processes you're not modeling others. You're probably missing out on a lot of important stuff. And then they start rattling off their favorite things. And usually I'm nodding at about half of the list because, yeah, that needs to be in. For example, temperature. You actually need to model a little bit about the temperature dynamics. That's not hard to do, but you need to remember to do it. What about the glial cells? Well, we need to do measurements because the glial cells, which were believed to be sitting there passively, actually seem to have a much more active role. And the actual problem here, and this is where I think the real work needs to be done, is setting up this research pipeline where we do some kind of scan, we try to emulate it, it doesn't work, and we can use the emulation to look at what didn't we simulate well, where is the gap, and then go back and see what we need to do. And this might be, of course, where we're going to get a big headache because we get surprises like, oh, maybe the electromagnetic fields really matter. Bioelectricity, I've usually been hand waving it away before. And then recently I read some papers and heard some lectures and realized, actually, this sounds like we might have to care about it way more. What about the microbiome and the body model? How detailed does it have to be, etc., etc.? So the whole research agenda is enormous and vast, and it's not exactly like we're expecting this to be done next year. But it, of course, has interesting links to questions about both the predictability of science and the predictability of technology. And even some people wondering, could we, if we had all the money, speed this up enough to get this done before we get an artificial general superintelligence?
Yeah. um, compared to the 2008 paper, you've seen progress in both the imaging and and in the computation, and also just tons of suggestions that there's a lot of other information other than, say, the neurons and and the glial cells that you're going to need to include. Yeah, anything? Have you seen any suggestions that we need, say, chemical dynamics, as in what the composition of the ions is within certain neurons or certain areas of the brain at certain times, as in
So, yeah.
down to the chemical level?
Well, there is this idea in standard computational neuroscience that you can divide neurons into compartment models. And these are small pieces, usually less than a micrometer, usually much less, where you assume everything is well mixed. So you assume that in a small piece of a neuron, well, those ions coming in and out from the pores in the cell membrane, they are going to be well mixed. So you only need to keep track of how many there are. And then, of course, a bit of diffusion in and out. Uh, in some cases, we know this is wrong. For example, in a normal synapse, it can be that the number of ions is, for example, calcium ions, which are quite important for the memory formation, they might run in the 300s. That's so small that you actually need to know the integer number of neurons rather than having some nice approximation as a floating point number. Even worse, there might be proteins that only exist in a few copies, and the number of copies actually do matter. So if it's sufficiently small compartments, everything turns very chunky. It's a bit like when you zoom into a very big, elaborate Lego model and finally start seeing the individual pieces. Eventually, you get down to the molecular level. Generally, few people believe that we need to simulate stuff on that level. There are always some people thinking that this is going to turn out to be super important. I think we have good reasons to doubt that, simply because the body is pretty robust. Brains can't break just because the numbers are slightly off. And a lot of the signals we have are not entirely reliable. Indeed, quite a lot of synapses, even though they're supposed to be firing because there is an incoming signal, don't actually release enough vesicles to trigger the other one. So you have a noise level in the system, and assuming the errors because of your modeling is smaller than that noise level and not regular enough to cause some weird interference effect, that should be fine. But this is one of those things where we actually need to do experimentations just to learn. I think in many ways, this is also part of standard good science. A lot of people in computational neuroscience don't really get the idea of brain emulation. They think that's totally bonkers and crazy because it's not proper science. It's not trying to understand something, it's trying to replicate something. I would say that once you replicate something, you have demonstrated that you understood the parts of it very well, and now you have a wonderful test bed. But I can totally see also the other experiment you want to do, and that is making a hyper detailed, low level simulation and see how well that tracks what you do if you do a less detailed simulation. I bet that once we've done our initial work, we're going to find that we can do computational simplifications in a lot of places that are going to be quite significant. I bet that a lot of individual neurons don't matter, and it's only groups of neurons that we need to simulate. But we need to have a test bench to actually be able to play around with that. But the deepest problem is, where are good levels of scale separation in the brain? So when you think about statistical mechanics, the air in the room you're in right now, you have a lot of molecules bouncing around in a complicated mechanical dance, but it all averages out on a slightly bigger size and time scale into pressure, sound waves, temperature. They don't exist really on the local scale. The sound waves you're hearing are actually individual molecules, but just a lot of them moving in a collective motion. So on the lower scale, they don't exist. But you can very easily do acoustics and totally ignore molecules for it. Similarly, we might hope that we have something similar in the brain, that there is this level where things average together. And if we don't have a perfect understanding of stuff on the lower level, it might not matter. The dreadful idea might be, of course, that maybe this level doesn't exist, or it's awkwardly low, high resolution. After all, we know in fluid dynamics where turbulence is very annoying because the big eddies generate the smaller whirlpools that generate even smaller ones, all the way down to the micro scale where it finally start averaging out. And if you try to do a computational fluid dynamic models and leave out the smaller scales, you get dry water. You get water that actually has the wrong macroscopic behavior in the turbulence. And that is, of course, the possibility that the brain might be like that. So one interesting approach, and this is where critics of brain emulation also might contribute a lot, is to try to see, can we demonstrate that something like that is going on? Because if we can prove that there is no good scale separation in the brain, then we can just pack things up and do something else.
And so going forwards from here, it's a matter of the computation continuing to increase. So the roadmap between here and whole brain emulation. So the Moore's law must continue, and we're still looking for other modalities to get an increased resolution of the of brain scans, and bringing that gap between doing a scan and then running a model on based on the scan results that we get, and trying to close the loop between the scanning that we get and then modeling it to see if the scans are reflecting an appropriate model of, say, how that area acts when it's actually being used.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
And then, of course, you are going to have a lot of other side things that are probably big project in their own, but didn't get mentioned. You need to make adequate body models and environmental models, for example. At the start, you might have something very simple to test on your simulated nematode worm. That's not going to be hard. But already when you get to the fruit fly, you actually need to simulate the smell space it's inhabiting. And of course, once you have a mouse model, given that mice are much more olfactory creatures than visual creatures, you better make a fairly decent smell simulation of the virtual environment it's living in. Similarly, there are interesting issues with Moore's law, which people are working on for other reasons, of course, and that is energy consumption. It's kind of very obvious that our brains running on 20 to 25 watts of power are way more energy efficient than the data centers we're currently running our neural models on. Now, we have very good reasons to want to make our computers more energy efficient anyway, regardless of brains and simulations. So I'm rather hopeful about that. But it is an interesting challenge that we need to solve anyway, because, well, if the computational cost is just too high, then we're not going to be doing any brain emulations anyway.
mm-hmm. And other than the continuation of Moore's law and the increased, what other breakthroughs do you think are going to be needed between here and whole brain emulation? I guess just picking up on the temperature and the other papers that you mentioned that are suggesting we need to model a lot. There's going to be other information that we need to factor in. I guess it's going to be sort of a matter of the general scientific consensus, say, trying out modeling one particular aspect and saying, okay, well, that helped us model this particular area a bit better. So other than bringing in information that we aren't currently using in our models, and the continuation of computing power and the increased resolution and the increases in scanning technology, are there any other things that we are going to need going forwards in whole brain emulation in terms of breakthroughs?
I think the really interesting one is that we probably need to develop a proper kind of big neuroscience. At this point, many people in computational neuroscience say, hey, what? We're already doing it. Just look at the big connectomics thing. Look at the European Brain Project and the eBrains database system that is now part of infrastructure. We're doing really, really big neuroscience. But what I'm meaning by this is actually making a pipeline of actually solving problems. Unfortunately, in academia, it's quite common that we find an important problem. We start studying it, we start writing papers, we gather data, and then we have very fun writing papers about the data and working on it, rather than saying we totally want to actually solve the problem. So you can make a beautiful career out of studying the glial cells or studying the neuromodulators and so on. You're not exactly in current academia aiming at actually getting a complete list of all neuromodulators. You're not going to try to actually find the functions of all cell types in the brain. Now, that is a very weird and different way of doing it. And I think it's on the horizon, because basically what is happening is that we might get ways of automating a lot of research, including trying to automate finding variables that are not modeled. Right now, this has mostly been done by people looking at the data and their simulation, seeing a discrepancy and going back and forth between the lab bench and the simulation. But I think that we might also get more and more large-scale methods for just gathering massive amounts of data and then trying to reconstruct what's going on. This is a bit similar to the whole project of brain emulation, of course, but this is more like applying this to domains like what are all the cell types in the nervous system. And in the past, you would have gone to a neuroanatomist and he might have spent a lot of time at the microscope. Today, people say, actually, we have genomics for this. Oh, proteomics. Okay, we're running things and we're getting these maps. We're still not great at doing these maps, but we're starting to get automated methods that find groups of cells that we don't even have a name for. We don't know what we do, but we can see that they have properties that are distinct from other ones. I think this is a field that needs to be developed further. And I think it's going to happen in domain after domain, not just neuroscience, that we actually use very big scanning, so to say, methods to take in a domain and then see just what is there. And then we have a lot of hard work on interpretation. Some people, of course, hope that, this is going to be solved by AI and big data, and that hopefully might work. Yeah, I think we're far away from doing that. But I do think that getting total inventories of various domains of the world might become more and more possible because of other advances in computation and sensing. It's a little bit like Google Earth. It's in principle, every square meter of Earth's surface has been imaged by now. Some of them not very well, but we actually have a very, very complete map. You can, in principle, do statistics on all of that. You can train neural networks on it. You can do quite a lot of powerful things because we have that complete data set. And I think this is going to happen in many parts of biology and medicine. It's just that we're not yet good at it. We're good at getting the data sets. We're rather bad at the interpretation part. And I think once we start getting a sense of how to do that, how to automate that, that's going to be the second bioinformatics revolution. The first one was that we got all this data. And then we've been using small algorithms and we've been kind of skimming stuff on top that are obviously useful and mostly confusing. I think the second one is when we get in better interpretation tools that are also general ones.
Mm. And are there any particularly, other than the modeling of the fly brain, are there any other very good efforts where we're actually deploying and having a good go at starting a project where we go ahead and build something?
So there have been several attempts at doing the C. elegans nematode, and they have been struggling because the nematode, although it's wonderfully simple and has a simple body, it turns out to be very hard to get the synaptic information we need to actually run a simulation. So that's also a pretty good humbling lesson on always select the right test animal for your project. It might be easier with the Drosophila because that brain has larger neurons. Um, I think that one of the most exciting things we came up with at that workshop was also maybe we should also start making artificial data. Because one of the big problems here is if I have trained my little fruit fly to run through a maze and then I take it, fixate its brain, scan it, and try to run the simulation, how do I know that that simulation is doing the same thing as the original brain? Well, if the simulation succeeds in running the maze, everything is fine. I have a very good idea that I succeeded. But it's pretty implausible that that's going to work on the first try. I'm going to need to iterate here. And that means that I actually need to have a biological system. I know exactly what it's supposed to do, and then check that once I scan it, I get exactly the right dynamics. The problem is, of course, most biological systems are not at all like that. Even something very well characterized, like the lobster stomatogastric ganglion or the retina, are pretty mysterious in some respects. So one solution might be to actually generate artificial data. This is, of course, quite often done in brain imaging. We have phantoms to test that our MRI machine is working. So you put, instead of putting a real patient in, you put in a block of plastic that we know exactly where stuff is, and then we can make sure that the machine is calibrated. And we could similarly actually use computational neuroscience to run a model, of course, and then generate imagery that we then hand over to the people trying to do scan interpretation and say, okay, I hidden a secret in this. There is a little circuit, and your job is now to find what that circuit is and figure out the secret I've written down on this paper in this envelope.
What milestones do you envision happening in the coming years?
So the first milestone, I think, is just getting together a current up-to-date understanding of what's going on in the whole field. That is a trivial milestone in one sense. Oh, it's just having to write a lot of papers, review a lot of stuff. But I think there is also an important to actually get a kind of consensus idea about what do we know, what don't we know, and where do we go from there. There is also this important idea of how do you do a translation from a scan to a simulation, even if you don't want to run an entire organism, even if you just scan a single neuron or a connection, getting that into the consciousness of computational neuroscience. So I think that that is going to be an important milestone conceptually. From a more interesting scientific perspective, I think actually coming up with modalities that are good at getting the detailed biochemistry of neurons into the computer are going to be very important. So right now, we can use electron microscope to find out the shapes of cells, at least some of them. And we can use immunostaining to find what kind of molecules are present. The problem is, of course, most immunostains, you can only do one on your tissue. But there are cool results from the Smith lab about doing array tomography. You slice up your tissue in a nice array on a slide. You use immunostaining to image where various molecules are. You wash away the immunostain. You add another one. And this way you can get a multimodal guess of where various things are. I still don't know if that is enough to get all the information we need. It still feels rather finicky. But the nice thing is you can also finally image that in an electron microscope. So now you can even get the cell membrane. Could you imagine automating this and scaling it up? I totally can see that one could do that. Ask people who work on chip fabs about it, and they will immediately start envisioning just lots of robots and lots of microscopes. Basically, it's not too different from what you get in a chip fab. Of course, ridiculously expensive. Most neuroscientists can only dream about that budget. But it's more about how that the technology exists. Then in the future, we should expect it to come down in cost quite a bit. After all, you are going to be able to buy cheaper and cheaper automation. We know that you get economies of scale. Buying one microscope is expensive. Buying 10 microscope is not 10 times as expensive. And if you're buying 1,000, actually it might become much cheaper. So another area interested in seeing is economies of scale on this.
Mm.
Right now, again, most people would say, yeah, that sounds like pie in the sky. That's not going to happen. And probably not over the next few years. But I do think that we've seen these kind of enormous scale ups in many other domains. Bioinformatics demonstrated it beautifully, of course, with the Human Genome Project, where costs were coming down exponentially. And once it was done, it kept on going down exponentially until we reached a bit of a plateau because of various issues about markets and monopolies rather than any fundamental limits on the cost of doing sequencing. And I think we can expect similar things in the near future. This is, of course, also because you get an intersection with other areas where stuff is happening. So, artificial intelligence is having big effects right now, mostly in the generative domain, where it seems to be maybe useful for helping us write things, certainly useful for making illustrations, at least if you don't have to look like reality, but just look cool. And I think that within a year, we're going to have systems that are better integrated with mathematics and databases that actually can give you help with actual work rather than just filling out grant proposals. But right now, that's where the large language models are best, writing very conventional, boring prose and probably interpreting conventional, boring prose if you're on the receiving end of the grant proposals. But I think we are going to see quite a bit of uses of AI to speed up these things. Many of the more mature forms of AI are indeed in the image processing, segmentation, etc., where they're already being very useful in neuroanatomy. And the area where I think we're going to see the big surprise over the next few years is probably actual robotics. So it used to be that I expected that, yeah, robotics is probably going to be one of the hardest problems to solve because the actual physical world is so messy. The noise and the signals, etc., handling real objects. But when you start looking at a controlled environment like a lab, suddenly the things that you need to handle are generally fairly similar to each other. You have a very well defined task, and many of the hand eye coordination skills that already seem to be under development can probably be applied there. So, lab automation is an area where I'm expecting big things to happen, which fills me with a bit with a dreadful feeling too. Because while in neuroscience this is brilliant and good, I'm less happy about lab automation where people might be able to use this to make pathogens. I think we actually do have a really serious problem about biosecurity because the risk pipeline from a bad idea over to coming up with a sequence and getting the sequence ordered in the test tube and transfecting an organism, multiplying it, testing it, and then releasing some doomsday pathogen. That's a fairly tricky pipeline to go through right now. You need various skills, and some of the steps actually requires you to have a lab. If that gets shorter and easier, more people are able to try to traverse it, and that might increase risk quite a bit. So we are going to have to do something about how to manage this lab automation. It's a quite powerful and quite dangerous technology. But this is, of course, the way the world is. We have these interesting intersections between quite separate domains, and keeping ahead, thinking about what can you do in the near and not so near future requires that you keep an eye on different domains. And even when you do that, you still miss something. I'm still kicking myself for having totally missed optogenetics, even though it was being developed in a lab down the road from where I was sitting. And I was supposedly on top of biotechnology and human enhancement and all that. And I was totally missing that, oh, people are making neurons light sensitive and sending and receiving light signals from them. Whoa. And they've been doing it for 8 years, and I still didn't notice it. So I bet that there's similar surprises brewing in the background right now.
Mm. And looking at I think that ties quite nicely into my next question, which is mostly around the regulation and how we sort of have a discussion about how we what society should think about whole brain emulation. So what do you think are going to be the regulations of whole brain emulation in the future, and how are we going to, as a society, decide what those regulations should be?
Mm. So right now, regulation is probably pretty unnecessary and kind of almost pointless. Because most of the work on regulation right now is probably going to be focused on AI for good reasons. And it might still impinge on the brain emulation because one way you might be able to control the use of AI in society might be to control the access to compute. So there might be more gatekeeping on large computing resources, which in itself is a really, really big issue about whether this is a good or a bad thing and under what conditions we can make sure this doesn't naturally lead to monopolies or bad misuses. But most regulators, they would just be chuckling if you mention brain emulation as something worth regulating because it's total science fiction. It doesn't seem to be anything that you need to regulate. I still have an argument that we need some regulation, but probably not in the terms of laws, but more like ethics rules. And that is, once our brain emulation starts becoming whole organisms and not just disjointed set of neurons, we might actually have a bit of ethical responsibility of doing this right. I'm not allowed to pinch the tail of a lab rat for no good reason, because that's just cruel and bad behavior. What about the virtual lab rat? I can use my virtual reality glove and reach into the simulation and pinch the virtual tail. And the signals get sent by the simulated C fibers to the brain. Various process happens, and the lab rat tries to scurry over to the simulated corner and gives up a little simulated squeal. Was there pain and suffering there, or is this just a model of what the real thing is? We don't know. It's a profound philosophical question. I doubt we are going to agree on that by the time this experiment can actually be done. But I think the better safe than sorry approach is, of course, to say that, yeah, you're not allowed to do that to your virtual lab animals, just like you're not allowed to do that on the real animals. If you have some compelling reason to believe that actually this simulated rat is not experiencing anything, maybe it's not behaving in the same way as a rat, etc., we might say, in that case, we should probably be cautious, but you might allow things. There might be good ways of giving virtual painkillers to these rats, etc. So I think actually the animal testing rules, that might be the first area where we should take emulations into account. That's still going to be a bit of an uphill situation, in particular because many people who like using simulated animals for testing, they almost have a vested interest in saying, look, this is the ethical thing. We don't have to use as many real animals that have obviously have real suffering. So hence we should be doing this. And adding strange restrictions there, that's just going to lower the take up of this ethically useful technology. Meanwhile, other people, especially people on the more transhumanistic side, who are hoping that this is an actual mind uploading, and eventually we can all upload into the cloud, they might be motivated to think that this probably has qualia, there is probably consciousness, we need to take care about these rats. There might be an interesting debate there among the ethicists, but I think the obvious regulation is just to make sure we do this ethically. Once you start getting close to humans, I think that's the point where regulation is going to start kicking in because it's obvious where we're going. At least that is as long as we're limited by Moore's law. But maybe it's hard to get a big simulation going, but it's relatively easy to do scans. So we're seeing more and more advanced animals. And at this point, people will start telling the regulator, we probably need to think about this. At least we need the medical ethics board to take this into account. There could, of course, be another scenario, and that is computing power goes off to infinity, but we can't get our scans to work. We're missing something. Our scientific methodologies don't work. We don't really have a good way. And eventually, some bright grad student figures out what we're missing. And suddenly, we can go from practically nothing to a human level brain emulation, which might be a much more of a shocker to society. In that case, we might actually end up with some ethically very problematic situations, or that we have human brain emulations existing in a legal and regulatory limbo. Now, I think this is somewhat premature to worry about because we're still a long way away. But it's kind of useful to do the groundwork, thinking about the moral principles we might want to apply, thinking about what kind of contracts would you do with the volunteers who want to donate the brains after death to be scanned and hopefully uploaded. What do we do with the bad emulation that is somewhat like them, but clearly not working? Do you shut it down and keep it until more advanced future technology can reconstruct it? You can figure out a lot of different approaches here. So generally, arguing for regulation, often people do that because it's also signifying that we have arrived with something. And we haven't arrived anywhere close to brain emulation yet. So we don't need to worry about regulation yet. But we should probably start thinking about the kinds of forms we want, because once it happens, it's probably going to change things rather profoundly. Robin Hanson's book, The Age of M, is kind of a look at the economics and sociology of a world where you can do brain emulation. And he basically confirms my idea that this is kind of economic plutonium, because you can multiply human capital by just running more copies of a person. It totally changes the world. The world economy kind of explodes and becomes enormously productive, but you also likely get a lot of very weird changes to society. That's probably something you want to be a bit careful about. You might say, actually, a lot of his book reads rather dystopian. It's funny, but different people think different parts of a dystopian and utopian parts. But we might want to actually try to figure out that transition well if we think that is coming. And this is, of course, very similar to the problems we're currently having with the AI transition. How do we handle that over the next few years? Every year, at least one more profession is going to find itself disrupted by emerging AI technology. And while that political process is going on, AI technology gets more and more powerful. Even if you don't expect an imminent singularity, it's going to be a bit of a mess when the middle management suddenly realize that they can be replaced with a chat GPT script, because they got political voice and they are going to fight rather strongly for their positions.
And I think that ties quite nicely into my next question, which is how do you define consciousness?
I don't. I
Ah.
don't know what consciousness is. So I have a background in computational neuroscience, and I'm hanging out with philosophers. I might even on some days say that, yeah, I'm kind of an ethicist, but I think I'm a lousy philosopher of mind. So when talking about consciousness, usually I do the quick move of bringing up Marvin Minsky's concept of a suitcase word. We're using consciousness for a lot of different things, like a big suitcase we just packed a lot of stuff into. But many of these things are not that interesting, or very interesting but different, like attention. Attention is not really the same thing as consciousness, but we quite often link it. If I'm attending to something, I'm usually conscious about it, but not always. Similarly, my self consciousness, that is a particular form of consciousness or a model that is very separate from that phenomenological consciousness. And once you dig into the bottom of that suitcase and you get to the really weird concept like qualia, the phenomenological experience of being oneself, etc. And I don't know what to do with them. On some days, I'm thinking that maybe everything is conscious, panpsychism is true, and that makes my life very easy, even though that leads to crazy conclusions. On other days, I'm a functionalist thinking consciousness is probably how it feels when information is being processed, which also leads to crazy conclusions. On most days, I just realize, I don't know. I just work here. I think we might learn important things from brain emulation in terms of consciousness. It might very well be that once we have good brain emulations, we are going to be able to discern many of the things going on in our minds when we are conscious or not conscious about things. We might be able to upload a few skeptical philosophers and ask them how they feel. And hopefully they will say, oh, darn, I feel conscious. I need to write a paper. And that it means we have learned something. Not necessarily that software and emulations of philosophers is conscious, but we have certainly learned something.
So I guess the definition of consciousness that I like that sort of appeals to me personally the most is it's the sensation of processing information. What are the arguments of consciousness that make you think it's say such a boggy topic that it's too difficult to pin down?
Well, I think it might not necessarily be impossible to pin down. It's just that it's hard for me to pin down because I'm not good at this. But it's pretty clear that even the professional philosophers are having a bit of a problem. And the classical explanation of this is, of course, yeah, it's private. I know I'm conscious, and I might suspect that you're conscious, but I don't know it in the same way. And this gives us a real problem of studying this phenomenon. The color green is much easier because we can both start talking about what the objects in the world are green. We can do measurements on them. We can meet people who are colorblind, and we can build up a much better understanding because we can compare notes. But of course, that is also true for consciousness to some extent. If we start comparing notes about how it feels to wake up, if we write about our introspection, if we look at teenage poems we wrote about our emotions and see the similarities and dissimilarities, that might actually tell us a fair bit. Even more importantly, insofar we believe that the structure of our brains actually are important for consciousness, which I think is a very clear claim that I think we actually have good reasons to believe, for example, due to anesthesia and drugs, etc. Then we can say, my brain and your brain actually look fairly similar. So we think that there are structural similarities. We actually have something to go on. There are even interesting cases in neuroscience with brain lesions like blind sight or Anton syndrome that tells us something about the conscious processing of vision. So we have handles. It's just that these handles are tricky. And quite often in science, our idea about what consciousness could be and how it works are a bit simplistic. And the philosopher will smugly tell us that when we propose our experiments. And then, of course, the really annoying thing to do back is to ask the philosopher, so what experiment should I be doing? That annoys the philosophers a lot. But eventually, you might find a few philosophers that actually have a good idea about experiments and work with them. I think there is actually a fair bit of work you can do experimentally that might illuminate aspects of consciousness.
And looking at a post whole brain emulation future, I remember reading in Robin Hanson's book Age of M, just in preparation for this, that he was saying that one of the main things that would differentiate the future would actually be the speed at which you could run whole brain emulations. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, neural signals essentially move at the speed of sound. Which is not that slow on the human size scale, but it still means that it's way slower than electrical signals. So you could imagine if you run a brain emulation on a computer, we should expect speed ups that could probably be at least a factor of 1,000, perhaps up to 1,000,000. Robin makes the point that really valuable thinking that you want done really fast, you might want to put into a very powerful and dense computer, while there is a lot of other thinking that you might run on less expensive hardware. And it's not just the signals transmission that slows things down. It's of course also how quickly you switch things. So again, a neuron takes about a millisecond to decide whether to fire or not. And a transistor, of course, famously can do this down on the nanosecond and even the picosecond scale. Yes, you need more transistors to simulate one neuron than just one, but it still can be much, much faster. I think the real limit here is probably nanotechnology, where you basically make machines down on the nanometer scale, at which point you get very high speeds. But you probably can't beat by using more molecular matter, because if you move too fast, things will start shaking apart. There are limits on how fast matter can compute. However, they are rather far away from the limits on how fast protoplasm and cell membranes can compute. So we certainly do have interesting optimization, like the myelinization of long axons. That means that instead of using the somewhat slow transmission where you get a domino piece falling a bit ion channels, instead you have an electrical signal that actually transmits and then get reinforced by ion channels at the nodes around here. That speeds things up by a factor of 10 to even 100 sometimes. But even that is still close to the speed of sound. So this speed up has interesting effects. One is, of course, that if you're 1,000,000 times faster, that means a day would be for you like 1,000,000 times longer. It would be a week. Um, so the subjective amount of time you can get at first sounds like, oh, you would get all the time in the world. But of course, if there are other uploaded minds running as fast as you, actually you're going to be running your projects. And the only thing that happens is that the projects get done faster in outside clock time. assuming, of course, that Parkinson's law and Hofstrade's law doesn't mean that you get overruns of this project. So actually everything gets much slower, despite everybody in principle having a million times more. Um, there is also this interesting thing that sending a signal somewhere uh, also seems to be now a million times slower. So right now we might be slightly annoyed that it takes 1 second to load a web page. But if I'm running at a million times faster, suddenly that means that it's a million seconds. That's a week. That web page is not going to cut it. I want it much faster. And it probably needs to be at a server much closer to the server I'm running on. So you get this situation where you tend to concentrate computation and you want to put the data you're interacting with more closely. Similarly, sending a signal to the moon again becomes much slower. Yeah, you can transmit yourself if you exist in a digital format to the moon, but it's actually, you might not experience it, but everybody else would say, yeah, it takes him kind of a subjective week to get to the moon. And that is using laser light. Um, so the universe, in some sense, drifts apart. It's almost like an expansion of the universe. So some people have argued this is why we're not seeing any aliens. We're so fast that we're sitting in these dense computing clusters and not caring about the outside universe. I think that is a mistake because stuff is going on in society on a lot of timescales, and many people do have long-term projects. I just read about a project in Germany that is slowly building a pyramid. Every 10 years, they're emplacing one concrete block. They're going to add the fourth one in September this year. I'm going to miss that one, but I'm thinking that maybe in 10 years' time, I should be going and watch the next one. That slow project in a speeded up civilization might be a rather quick project, of course, as outside clock time goes. But this manipulation of speed allows a lot of interesting things. You can speed up certain things at a great cost. You can run other things at a lower cost. And I would expect a civilization also potentially drifting apart into different bands of speed, which to some extent is already happening now, of course, because not everybody is keeping up with the latest developments in certain technologies, and others are quite happy to tend their gardens. And the measure of how good a civilization is, of course, if it can actually keep itself together and still function when people are running at different speeds, different minds, different values, etc. So we need probably a fair bit of innovation even in political science here.
Speaking of the political science, as we go out and colonize the stars, just due to the speed of light, there's going to be so much time delay between different parts of intergalactic species that it's quite reasonable that they'll have very different values and we'll have very different values over time. So before going out into the universe, you're going to have to make sure that any sort of core values are really sort of absolutely air watertight before you go out and colonize the stars. Otherwise, I mean, that could be one of the worst case scenarios. You mistakenly get an incorrect philosophical assumption, goes out and then spreads like wildfire throughout the universe. I guess that's going to be another really crucial part, and eventually we'll get just due to the distances, we'll get different parts of a intergalactic species that have pretty different values.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about this consideration about clock speed in the brain emulation world is that it already kind of makes the solar system or even Earth almost like this interstellar or intergalactic civilization. Sending a signal to Australia right now, it's about 1/7 of a second for me. The delays I'm getting when chatting with a colleague in Australia, they're good enough. We can still have a good conversation. If we speed up, suddenly those delays become untenable. We need to start sending each other email. And similarly, if you think about running an empire, well, classical empires were kind of limited by the size that if the far provinces are so far away that they can rebel before you know it and build up an army and defend themselves successfully, you can't hold together your empire. So you had a kind of information-based size of that empire. So if you imagine the kind of uploaded Roman Empire, it would probably be physically much smaller than the current actually existing Roman Empire. Now, when you go into space, one of the interesting things is the light speed limit, which is, of course, terribly annoying to many of us who like space and like science fiction and want to go to the stars. It is also a wonderful insulator. It actually means that different things can happen without actually interacting with each other until a light signal can go across. This is actually a good thing, because when you think about risks to society, when stuff can go wrong, you might actually want to separate things. But the economic incentives on Earth right now means that we're getting a globalized world where everything is connected to everything else. And this is not safe from a systemic risk standpoint. And we are kind of aware that, yeah, we need circuit breakers in the stock market. We probably should try to decorrelate different economies from each other, but it's very, very hard to do. Even when you have something like the US versus China that for geopolitical reasons are trying to pull apart, it's very hard not to have a lot of trade between them, and that is going to connect them, which means that you can get financial contagion going from one side to the other. Now, if Elon Musk moves over to Mars, he's going to be at least 15 minutes away as a light speed signal goes, and usually much more. That means that his stock market and the Earth stock market are going to get decorrelated in an interesting way. Even more, of course, if somebody moves into the outer solar system, they're going to be necessarily decorrelated. And this is, of course, great also from the perspective of computer viruses or memetic viruses or even cultural divergence, because we might want to have a diverse world where not everything is a Starbucks culture where we're all going to the same chains and getting the same broadcast media. And you can't really do that if you're on the same planet. I think this is actually one really compelling reason to go to space, except that compelling reasons doesn't necessarily mean that they're economically good reasons. We still need to figure out that part. So getting back to the interstellar and intergalactic empire, the causal disconnectedness means that you gain some safety, you gain the potential diversity. But as you said, if we do something wrong, then we can also do bad things that can never be taken back. Indeed, I'm working on a paper right now with my colleague Asher Sore about directed panspermia, the idea of spreading bacterial spores to nearby stars in order to spread life. There are some people who think this is the best thing ever. This is a moral duty that we really ought to do. This is basically what the biosphere wants us to do. But there are also people thinking about welfare, realizing that there's a lot of suffering going on in a normal biosphere. If we do this, we might generate biospheres full of animals that suffer. And if you take a suffering focused view, actually, this is horrible. We made the universe much worse. So their perspective is we must absolutely not do this. Now, this is an interesting philosophical debate up until the point when somebody is actually sending off some bacterial spores and it becomes a fait accompli. And there are people I know who literally want to do this. And we're getting closer and closer to the point where it can be done. So both Asher and me are kind of rather united in that we probably need to avoid doing that until we have a bit better consensus, a bit better ways of dealing with it. Either because we concluded what kind of suffering ethics is the right one, or more likely, at least we can agree on some kind of compromise that makes things less risky. And I think this goes also for the big expansion. So it's very plausible that advanced civilizations can expand over vast volumes of space and in some sense set the rules for that part of space. So you better know what rules actually are good rules, or even hedge your bet so it's less likely that you're doing something truly atrociously bad and more likely that you're doing at least some of what's good. Now, we might imagine that we solve our problems on Earth and sit around among the crystals and togas and do philosophy for 1,000 years before finally deciding, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have agreed to settle the universe according to this tome of moral principles. A more plausible one is, of course, that it doesn't happen like that, but we might still have had time to fix some of the more obvious bugs. And we might even have come up with ways of communicating at least some of the updates if we, while in transit, we discover a few fundamental ethical errors we've made. So I think there is an interesting question how you go about settling the larger universe. Right now, we need to survive long enough to be able to do this in a useful way. We also probably don't want to paint ourselves into corners too much. We need an open future. And I think this is a very good general principle. There are relatively few ideologies and views that actually think it's good to limit your choices and options for the future. And I think this is something we can get a generally rather wide consensus about across a vast number of ideologies and takes. So that is one important thing. Maybe that future discussion among the crystals and togas is going to be more about how do we ensure an open future, except cutting off those possibilities that lead to obviously dreadful things.
My next question is about cryonics. So, atheism is increasing generally throughout the entire world, and especially in the developed world. Why do you think cryonics is not more popular than it is now?
So cryonics doesn't give you an extended life in a nice, warm, fuzzy way. It doesn't give you a guarantee that, oh, yes, this is going to totally work and it's going to be totally organic and nice, etc. It's taking this rather sterile and intellectual take on how to live longer. Okay, you can't be saved with current medical technology. Well, maybe if we freeze you, maybe you can be revived in the future. It's just that this has a lot of maybes, and it admits that. If you look at most of the things people do to live longer, either they're relatively obvious things like don't smoke, exercise, do healthy stuff. But even there, when you talk to people, you find that they almost make a moral argument. Look, I'm being virtuous. I'm not smoking. I'm exercising. I'm eating this healthy food. I deserve to live longer. This is, of course, wrong because this is just mechanics, basically. Yeah, if you get exercise, your body doesn't quite break down as much. It does statistically and increase your healthy lifespan. But there are plenty of people who exercise a lot that don't have long lives, and there are a few couch potatoes that live very long time. It doesn't work like that. It's not that moral thing. And generally, we tend to construct our ideas about extended life far too much in terms of morality and hope and these very human emotions, which, after all, is kind of why we want to live longer. And we're not that interested in the biological continuation of our organism, but rather that our life, our narrative, the feeling of ourselves continues. And that means that cryonics, by pointing out these maybes and being rather technical, doesn't give that nice story about that, yes, I deserve to live longer and because I did these virtuous things. You can still, of course, mix up moral stuff. I quite often explain that I'm working hard on existential risk reduction. So I hope future generations might appreciate that if they consider should we thaw out that Anders guy from the liquid nitrogen or not? Oh, he actually tried to make sure our world came into being. That might count in my favor.
I remember you in a previous podcast having some fantastic logic behind this. So I think that you said, okay, if someone threatened to kill me, and they asked me for say £2 million, well, I'd go, okay, well, I might be in debt for a while, and I might I'd have to cobble together some cash and get a massive loan, but I could probably pay it off eventually, and I probably would. If push came to shove, pay about £1 million to £2 million to save my own life, and then you times that by about 5%, you can get to about £40,000, $40,000, and that for the cost of sort of putting your head into cryonics. Where do you think the 5% likelihood of success comes from? Because I've heard that number thrown around quite a lot.
So in my case, I admit I'm kind of made it up. I'm thinking about, okay, how likely does this look to work? And I have friends who think that it's more than 75%. And of course, for the critics saying zero. Uh, and when I look at the technology, on one hand, I'm struck by this is relatively primitive. We're having these systems about perfusion and the adding cryoprotectants. And yeah, that works. It's the kind of gory medical engineering that one would expect. I've seen tissue samples under electron microscope from cryopreserved brains, and they don't look great. On the other hand, I've been rather convinced by Eric Drexler's arguments in nanosystems that, yeah, we can eventually make nanomachines that could actually figure out where stuff is. And given my functionalist ideas about brain emulation, yeah, I actually do think there is enough information to reconstruct my brain, etc. So when I put all this stuff together, I end up saying at least 5%.
Hmm.
I think it's higher than that, but then I immediately come up with some other reason why it might be lower. So I end up with this very rough guesstimate. Uh, for example, one of the main problems might not be so much whether cryonics itself works, but can I get a proper cryopreservation if I'm dying? a fair number of people I heard about that were interested in cryonics didn't have a contract and then they died or had circumstances that prevented a good cryopreservation. Similarly, companies running cryonics, well, some of them have gone bust. So we know there is a kind of half-life of how long the storage might last. So all these things together give me this super rough feeling. And I think 5% is in the lower end. But I'm kind of happy that if it's above 5%, then it's rational for me. Now, you might come to a different conclusion, and that is fine because this is very much subjective probabilities. We don't have the actual answer yet. Eventually, at the end of time, we're going to be able to do proper statistics of how often cryonic suspensions work, but we don't have that statistics. So now it's a decision under uncertainty.
I remember reading a really good Wait But Why blog post by Tim Urban, which was basically, and it was about cryonics, and it basically said, okay, let's say you're on an airplane and the pilot comes on the line and says, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to crash into a mountain. This is going to happen with absolute certainty. There is a backpack on the side which has a 5 to 10% chance of working, which has a parachute in it. There's one enough for there's one for everyone if you should choose. Good luck. Of course you would take that parachute. You would most certainly take that parachute. Just when the argument's phrased like that, it sounds so much more appealing. I think maybe it's the maybe it's people actually having to face up with their own mortalities. I think people quite often like to not think about it.
Oh yeah, I had a friend who said that signing up for cryonics was one of the hardest thing he ever did because he was so scared of death that he didn't want to think about it and hence had a problem signing up for cryonics, which on one level sounds crazy. You're trying to reduce your risk of death, and if you're afraid of death, shouldn't it be much easier? But that's not how our emotions actually work. There are many things that are important and we put off. I have a lot of projects and emails to send and apologies to do that I'm putting off because, yeah, it would be good if I did it. But it's so dreadful to think about it. So I'm procrastinating. And this is, of course, what's going on with a lot of our, not just individually, but on a human societal level, which is another strong reason why cryonics is not terribly popular.
And so moving on a bit to AI and AI safety, are there any arguments that could feasibly make you not worried about AI safety?
Yeah, I think there are. So there is the small scale AI safety issues, which I think we can put to the side, like malicious use and that bad actors are able to use them, and that maybe totalitarian states can get powerfully empowered by AI. These ones or I leave them out now, but I think many of them are really important, especially the totalitarian one. So if we just look at the kind of super intelligent AI is going to wreck the world style argument, what I think would convince me that this is not much of a problem is if we saw actually a kind of attractor states that seems to be well aligned. So the standard argument people in my circles have been making over years is, yeah, values and intelligence, they're independent, orthogonality thesis. And also you have this tendency towards getting power seeking and other dangerous behaviors. That's the instrumental convergence thesis. Now, then there is this third part. Yeah, and human values are not attractor points. They're complex, they're fragile, they're hard, and hence we should expect that if we make systems that are powerful, they're going to be doing things in the world that are very powerful. That's kind of a fourth aspect. Intelligence is very powerful. And we should expect it to be almost anything but human values, and that's going to end up very badly for us. Now, I think the orthogonality thesis that values and intelligence are separate, that one is almost obvious. I would be very shocked if that actually wasn't true. If somebody demonstrated that, that would be a philosophical achievement that will be remembered for thousands of years. The instrumental convergence thing, I think, is so broad that it's hard to prove or disprove it. But what if it turns out that alignment with human values actually turns out to be a natural thing? We're seeing that this in the large language model to some extent. I had my standard version of a paperclip maximizer that instead is you had the advice AI for companies. It gives advice and it improves profit. And then I have a storyline about how that leads you down the garden path to always obeying what the AI says. And gradually this gets more and more ruthless and unethical. But you can't stop it by now because you fired all the bosses that would disobey the AI, and the AI run companies are all having good lobbyists making sure that it's mandatory, etc. Now, I tried this scenario actually on ChatGPT, and it actually gave sensible response about why one shouldn't be behaving like this. Now, that's not necessarily saying that ChatGPT was well aligned with humans. It was just saying stuff that sounded like if this was the actual advice AI, it would actually not be too dangerous. That might be very different from what a real advice system would actually do, because ChatGPT has been trained on human communications, and a lot of what we're saying is reassuring stuff, even though some people backstab others. So it might actually be not entirely reliable. But we could imagine that we get more effects like this, where we can see that since we train on a lot of human data, there is a lot of internal consistency between what we say and do, and between things like compassion, tolerance, liberty, etc. A lot of our moral world is actually somewhat mapped out by what we're saying and doing. And that might actually be learnable. Indeed, there is this phenomenon in AI called grokking, where once you train enough on something, suddenly the model becomes much better at modeling that thing, because it seems like it latches onto the underlying regularity. So the classic example is when you use numbers and you teach it to add or multiply. Eventually, it converges to an internal algorithm that actually does this perfectly. That algorithm might actually be quite alien from how we do it, but it's mapping on very well. It might be that we could be grokking for human values and virtues. And it might also be grokking that then makes something that generalizes well. That's something that still needs to be checked. So this is something that, if it happened, would convince me that maybe this problem is less dangerous. There is, of course, a final possibility, and that is we discover that, yep, superintelligence is not very good at changing the world. Just because you're smart doesn't mean that you're in control of everything. That would be a very sad piece of evidence that well, now we got superintelligence that's very just as powerless as we are, and we're all in it together. But it might be a world that is relatively safe, except that now it's nobody at the rudder, so we're having that other problem that nobody's in charge.
And what do you think are the most urgent issues to fix, or the most urgent issues to work on in AI safety right now?
So I think we need to have best practices and standards for testing and evaluating safety along various directions. Um, and I think we're getting there. Maybe not fast enough, but I think this might be doable. Um, One of the beneficial things about the AI law that the European Union is dealing with right now is that if it passes, it's going to be actually mandating certain testing methods. There are going to be standards for that. And those standards, if they're well written, could mean that we actually have ways of weeding out dangerous AI. And they're also going to create an incentive for developing better testing methods. So if you think about GPT-4, the system card they did for that contains a lot of interesting testing the Alignment Research Center did for seeing various ways it might misbehave. And they found a fair number of very concerning things, and those problems have been kind of corrected, which of course also ends up with this problem that now we have a slightly lobotomized AI that is not as useful as it could be. But of course, a very useful AI is potentially very dangerous, while a totally safe AI is totally harmless, but also kind of useless. So there is this interesting curve between them, and it's not obvious where we want to be. So I think setting standards, best practices, and developing basically a reliability and safety theory for AI, that's going to be urgent and useful and actually fairly profitable. That's another important thing we need to remember. Just asking for regulation doesn't mean that they're any good, because the incentives they set might not have been well designed. But if you actually have testing that actually gets closer to what's actually useful, I think that sets incentives much better.
And what areas in AI safety do you think are currently overlooked and could do with more examination?
That's a good question. So I think we have been looking at the low-level stuff like biases and misbehavior, and that is, of course, realm where the AI ethicists are running the show. And we have been thinking about the abstract misbehaviors on the very powerful systems, where you assume that they can solve any problem they need to solve, and then how can that go wrong, and how do we set the motivations? I think in between there is this problem of systemic risk. So instead of having one super powerful AI, you have a bunch of AIs advising people, and you get systemic risk because maybe their advice is all very similar. If everybody is using a version of ChatGPT, fine-tuned maybe for your own company, but they're all giving advice, they might be making the same mental mistake in advising all the companies. We've seen these problems, of course, in banking when everybody is using the same kind of model in the wrong way. I've been doing a collaboration with the insurance industry where they were worried that they were all using the same catastrophe models. And we can totally imagine the same thing happening when everybody is using the same advice systems. But there are probably more emergent things like that. So this happens not because the individual AI or the individual user are malicious or have a bad emergent intention, but it happens because we have a system. And to some extent, this is, of course, what economists normally deal with. Many economists would say, hey, this is actually our line of business. To which I would respond, yes, please help us out here. You actually need to learn about AI very quickly and help us figure out how do we avoid getting the wrong kind of emergence. And it's a little bit like thinking about market failures. It's a bit about what objectives can you bake into a market to make it more reliable. Are there regulations or other properties you need to add to avoid various forms of systemic risks that could be dangerous? So I think this is a totally overlooked area because it's not clean computing. It's not clean ethics. It's not really clean economics either. It's sitting there uneasily in the middle, and I think it's kind of important.
Going back to our mortality and thinking about our own death, what is your attitude towards your own mortality and your own death?
So I decided rather early on to treat life like a kind of computer game. I want to play as long as it's fun. So in some sense, it's a kind of game of hide and seek between me and the Grim Reaper. And of course, as long as it's fun to play, I'm going to try to keep on playing. But not existing, that's not too bad. There are forms of existing that might be really bad and you really want to avoid. But actually stopping existing, yeah, that's just boring is the wrong term here because it's an evaluation being done from inside my life. But yeah, that's just like the fact that I didn't exist a million years ago or I don't exist on the moon right now. So the fact that my current life is some kind of thread through space-time, yeah. The interesting part is, of course, that thread might turn weirder in the future. If we get brain emulation, it's going to be a different kind of thread, and it might branch out. Indeed, I might end up with a very extended sense of identity, which means that I'm totally fine with little sub-threads ending all over the place because that's just useful. But the main bundle continue very far in the future, and also turning into different kinds of beings. After all, if life extension works really well, we might have to face the fact that our future selves might be so dissimilar from us that they might actually be different people. Now, I'm fine with that because the continuity of a threat might still matter. That future post-human Anders might be thinking unfathomable thoughts and having values I can't even understand. But if it can trace itself back to me and the starting point, and along the path, all the Anderses across time agree that, yep, I'm transforming to somebody I more or less approve of. And even though the future is hazy and the past is kind of weird because I was so young and dumb back there in the 21st century, that is fine. Now, the problem is, of course, that maintaining identity might not even be worth doing too much. Derek Parfit, who used to be my landlord, famously did thought experiments showing that personal identity is probably more of a psychological thing. And I agree with him. So I had some interesting trouble when I was arguing with him and Peter Singer about the rationality of cryonics, because Peter Singer, of course, pointed out that actually, Anders, that money you're putting into freezing yourself, you could actually send it to Africa and save a lot of lives, which I think is also a totally valid criticism. There is this balance between how much do I spend on myself versus helping others. And maybe one should be much more cautious about assigning infinite value to oneself. So I think taking a somewhat relaxed approach to personal identity, taking a somewhat relaxed approach to death is worthwhile. That, of course, doesn't mean that I'm not going to run like hell if I find a tiger in my living room. But it's part of that big game. And I want to just get the kind of high score that I care about. Not necessarily the kind of high score in that game that evolution cares about in terms of inclusive fitness and having lots of offspring, or the kind of high scores some societies might care about in terms of maximum amount of money or maximum amount of political power.
The perception of self definitely makes me think of the teleportation problem, where you get in the teleporter, it disintegrates you appear somewhere else, but then the teleporter breaks, and then so you've got two yous, and then where the you that was on the other side of the teleporter isn't exactly going to be great to go. Fantastic when being told, right, okay, you've now got to be disintegrated so that other you can continue. I guess with
I would, of course,
so
argue that why disintegrate me? Now there are two of me. This is double the value. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, would your perception of being the you in that was on the other side of the teleporter that needed to be disintegrated? I do think that the whole sort of continuous perception of yourself being one continuous stream of consciousness or one continuous entity is very important. What would be your thoughts for the you on the other side of the teleporter that broke, that needs to be disintegrated? Would you prefer to have two yous?
I'm kind of fine with that, at least intellectually. I bet that if I were actually in that situation, I'm going to do my utmost to escape and so on. But intellectually, I think this is fine because I don't regard myself as this particular Anders, but rather the equivalence class of all sufficiently Anders-like processes, which covers quite a lot of different things. Indeed, since I also believe in the many worlds theory, that means that there is actually quite a lot of alt Anderses in nearby universes too, and I care about them. If I could sacrifice myself in this universe, but knew that this would help the other Anderses, that might actually be a really rational thing to do, at least intellectually. Again, in practice, I think emotionally this would be rather tough to do. So I do think that Derek's argument works well. I think we generally have this intuitive feeling that, oh, yes, I am the center of the world, everything revolves about me, I'm the most important thing. That is exactly what evolution wants us to believe, because that makes animals that do their best to survive. And it doesn't matter that they might actually be wrong about them being the center of the world, because evolution doesn't care about you being right, just that you have a lot of grandchildren. So what is going on is, of course, I have a self model that is constantly building up this model of me sitting here in my chair and linking that body image with my mental image of who I am. Even though I know intellectually that add a bit of electrical stimulation to my parietal cortex and this model goes totally bonkers, and I might suddenly regard myself existing somewhere else or being one with the universe. And indeed, meditators, of course, quite often end up noticing that actually I'm not my self model, and that I thing actually doesn't really exist. It's a construction. You might talk about a field of phenomenological consciousness that is still separate from the consciousness of other beings. And yet that one might still not be very linked to that self model. So there is a lot of flexibility here. Most of the time, however, when crossing the street, it's not a good idea to regard yourself as a universal field of consciousness and regard you and the approaching cars as actually instantiations in this field. It's a very useful thing to think of yourself as a separate being that has a value. That means that you need to move out of the way from that car. That is an effective way, under most circumstances, to act in the world. So I do think that, yeah, personal identity is overrated. And still, it's a somewhat useful fiction. It's a little bit like sound waves. They are also kind of fiction in the sense that it's just a collective motion of a lot of individual atoms, except that we're using sound to communicate. Sound waves makes a lot of sense in the acoustics. And we can have these top-level phenomena which sometimes don't apply, but might in many situations be a practical thing to use.
Mm. And so, moving on to my last question, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah, this is kind of a standard problem if you're a philosopher at a cocktail party. If you're a doctor, of course, people will say, "Oh, my knee hurts. Can you take a look at it?"
Yeah.
And if you're a lawyer, somebody will immediately start talking about the ex-wife and the impending divorce. Philosophers get the meaning of life question.
Mm.
And of course, the typical philosopher answer is that depends on what you mean by the meaning and life and the and is. But I do think that there is something interesting going on here because I think there is individual meanings of life. What is getting you out of bed every morning? We are meaning-seeking creatures. If we're doing things that doesn't feel meaningful, we quickly become depressed. We need something, even if it's wrong that it's actually not meaningful, but we think it's meaningful. That actually helps us organize our lives. And then, of course, there is this bigger issue of doing things that might actually, in the large, be a good thing to do. So I think when it comes to meaning of life, I don't think evolution has a meaning. It's just something that happens. But then it generates these meaning-seeking nervous systems that then take over. And we look around and start coming up with all sorts of interesting explanations. So on the direct practical level, of course, yeah, you need to feel that your life is meaningful, which typically means that you need to find something that has value on its own. And certainly you can do a hedonistic account, say, yeah, maximize pleasure. But as philosophers love pointing out, that usually feels rather empty. It's rather hard to do well. Actually, doing things like helping others, developing your virtues, becoming an excellent person, whatever that means, usually has a much more lasting effect. There is this spectrum of happiness going from that instant gratification of a lovely piece of dark chocolate over to a life well lived. And we probably need a diet of happiness all over that space. Evolution doesn't really care about that as long as we have enough grandchildren, but we care. We generally want to have that fullness because we're that kind of creatures, and we're also remaking ourselves to be even more meaning seeking. The fact that today we can afford to care about the meaning of life, that many of us go on about, oh, the modern world and its lack of meaning, and this is a problem, is a great step forward because in the Middle Ages it would have just been, okay, we're starving, and that is what we're going to try to fix. But even there, of course, they had this idea of, oh, we need to achieve salvation. But when you look at people's idea about heaven in the Middle Ages, it was usually fairly simplistic. It was mostly an absence of all the suffering and getting a good meal up beyond the pearly gates. So what's happening now is that we're not just searching for meaning, we're generating new kinds of meaning. And these new kinds of meaning are quite often various forms of moral meaning. It might mean helping others. It might mean recognizing that, oh, other beings are like me and I don't like suffering, and I might want to reduce their suffering, or I might want to make them as happy as I am. That is feeling very meaningful, even though when you're out there struggling in the world to actually do something useful, even when you're sitting in dreadfully boring political meetings, or you're struggling in the surgery, or trying to get your code to compile, it doesn't feel particularly good when you do it. It's still worth doing. A lot of stuff in the world is worth doing, even if it's not particularly pleasant. Some of it has to be done. A fair bit doesn't have to be done, but is a good thing it's getting done. And I think we can scale this up even on the larger scale. I do think that it makes sense to talk about civilizational virtues. Just like you can culture your own virtues and be a more courageous and witty and nice person, we can make civilizations that are also more courageous, more truth seeking, more prudent about risks. And maybe on the larger scales, we can think about making a civilization that they actually do meaningful things in the universe. Because intelligent life has this amazing ability to make very unlikely events happen regularly. We have taken various forms of rocks and put them together in such a way that they perform computations and transmit information across the world. That doesn't happen naturally, but we do it regularly. We scaled it up an industry that makes this very efficiently. We can rearrange the universe as we expand into it in all sorts of forms. And now the question is just which forms are high value? That is something we can both explore. We can try to figure it out by philosophy or neuroscience and other methods. And we can also explore adding the actual value, whether that is creating happy minds or creating great art or having very fun sports or doing deep spiritual explorations. And there might also be forms of structure of the universe that we want to have in the large. The expansion of the universe is accelerating as far as we know, which means that there are large part of the universe we can never touch. And there are many parts that are going to become causally separated forever if we don't reach them before a timeline in about a few 100 billion years. Now, potentially, we could start moving some of that matter together to get something that lasts longer. So, if it turns out that meaning is about something that has to be causally connected, that maybe we want to have a large civilization doing wonderful things, then we might need to go out there and move matter together to make that big cluster withstand the expansion of the universe. It might also be that actually meaning is much more local. It's all about that happy little experience, that lovely little cottage in a Cotswold-like village on some remote planet. And they don't have to be connected. So we just want to spread it out. Or it might be that actually the amount of this doesn't matter. We have these different options and we don't really know which one is the right one. Maybe we should hedge and try to do all of them. Maybe we just need to sit down and lower our expectations a bit. But we have these options. We're kind of a seed that can then go out and crystallize the universe. And that gets to maybe the biggest and most grandiose kind of meaning that you can imagine. So my colleague Guy Kahane wrote this very fun paper on our cosmic insignificance. So it starts out by observing that the universe is really vast and you're standing under a starry sky and thinking that, oh, I'm so small and insignificant. And then Guy notes that we have this weird problem. I can be insignificant in a tiny little room too. The size of the universe doesn't actually have any effect on my insignificance. So what does it mean to be significant? And I think Guy really hits the nail on the head. For something to be significant, that means that a description of the bigger system it's in that leaves out that thing is a very incomplete description. So if we are the only intelligent species in the universe and somebody is describing the universe and leaving out that, oh yes, we're conscious intelligence and creating art and doing weird stuff, that's a very bad description of the universe. It kind of doesn't get what is going on, especially if we go out and reorganize the universe on a fairly large scale. Guy was not thinking about this. He was even in that paper kind of joking. Do we really have to move galaxies to be significant? And I think it might be true. He was concluding, of course, that actually there could be alien life out there. So then we're just one among many and we're insignificant again. But we don't know that. And so far, I think we have to act as if we're the only spark of consciousness, the only spark of love and emotion and value in the universe and try to make that expand. And that both makes us significant and feels very meaningful. And this might be an interim meaning of life until we come up with something better.
What a fantastic and inspirational place to end. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. A massive thanks to Dr. Sandberg for taking his time to talk to us. You can find links to all of his work in the description. Thanks for listening and catch you next time.